Funny how people laugh the loudest at mistakes they've never had the courage to make. The glass slipped from Emily Carter's hand before she could stop it. A single miscalculation, less than an inch too far off balance, and the sound of it hitting the marble floor cracked through the restaurant like a sharp note in a quiet song, heads turning, conversations pausing, and then, almost on cue, the laughter began, light at first, then spreading across the table nearest her like a ripple no one bothered to hold back. Someone muttering something under their breath, another voice louder. Careless, guess they're hiring anyone now. And just like that, she became the moment, the entertainment, the mistake everyone else was relieved not to be. Emily didn't rush, didn't panic, even as the ice cubes slid across the polished floor and the water crept toward the edge of an expensive leather shoe. Her fingers paused midair for half a second, then lowered, steady, deliberate, reaching for the fallen glass as if the noise around her belonged to a different room entirely, her breathing even, her expression calm, but her grip just tight enough to betray the tension she refused to show. Across the room, seated alone at a table by the window, Daniel Hayes had already noticed her long before the glass fell, not because she stood out, but because she didn't. The way she moved through the space without drawing attention, efficient, precise, almost invisible, the kind of presence most people overlooked without thinking. But he had learned, over years of watching rooms like this, that the quiet ones often carried more than they revealed. And now, as the laughter echoed, his gaze didn't shift to the broken glass. It stayed on her, watching the way she handled the moment, the way she didn't look up, didn't search for approval, didn't shrink under the weight of it. A man at the nearest table leaned back in his chair, smirking, lifting his phone just slightly, not enough to be obvious, just enough to capture. Hey, be careful, sweetheart. That tray probably weighs more than you do. Another chuckle, another wave of amusement, the kind that fed on itself, growing louder because no one chose to stop it. Emily picked up the last piece of glass, placing it carefully onto the tray she had steadied against her hip, then reached for a folded cloth, wiping the floor with small, controlled movements, her posture straight, her focus unbroken, as if the only thing that mattered was restoring order, not defending herself, not correcting anyone, just doing the job in front of her. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in judgment, but in recognition, because he had seen that kind of composure before. Not in boardrooms filled with executives who spoke too much and listened too little, but in the rare moments when pressure stripped people down to who they really were, and most failed, most reacted, most tried to prove something, but she didn't. She simply continued. And something about the silence she chose, shifted the air in a way no one else seemed to notice. Not yet. The laughter still lingered, softer now, fading into whispers, but the moment wasn't over, not to him, because while everyone else had already decided what this was, a mistake, a reason to laugh, he was still watching, still measuring, as if the real story hadn't even begun. The manager appeared before the floor had even fully dried, his polished shoes stopping just short of the damp cloth in Emily's hand, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the remaining murmurs. What happened here? Not a question, not really, more like a conclusion already forming. Emily rose to her feet, cloth folded neatly in her palm, her eyes meeting his just long enough to answer without defensiveness. The tray slipped. Sir, I am replacing the order now. Simple, direct, no excuses. The manager exhaled through his nose, glancing briefly at the table that had been laughing, as if weighing which side mattered more, reputation or reality, and then he nodded once, curt. Fix it quickly, and make sure it does not happen again. Before turning away, already done with the moment, already moving on, but the table was not finished. One of the men leaned forward, tapping his glass lightly with a finger, the faint clink carrying just enough to draw attention again. Hey, maybe get someone more experience this time. A few smiles followed, quieter now, but still there, still feeding off what had already happened. Emily did not respond. She simply inclined her head slightly, the smallest acknowledgement, then turned toward the service station, her steps measured, unhurried, as if nothing about the last 60 seconds had changed her pace. Behind her, Daniel Hayes watched the exchange unfold with the same steady focus, but something had shifted in his expression, something more defined, because this was no longer about a dropped glass. It was about how easily a room decided someone's worth based on a single moment. He had seen it before, in different forms, different settings, boardrooms where one wrong number erased years of work, meetings where one hesitation labeled someone as unprepared. The pattern was always the same, and it always revealed more about the observers than the person being judged. Emily reached the station and began preparing a new tray, her movements precise, aligning each glass exactly, checking the balance before lifting it, her fingers adjusting the weight distribution with quiet expertise, not rushed, not careless, the kind of control that only came from repetition, from doing the same thing hundreds of times until it became second nature. A server beside her leaned in slightly, whispering, just loud enough to be heard. "You okay?" Emily gave a small nod, not looking up. "I am fine." And that was all. No complaint, no frustration, just acceptance and continuation. Across the room, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting briefly to the other diners, watching how quickly they had returned to their conversations, as if the moment had already been consumed and discarded, their laughter fading into the background noise of clinking glasses and low voices. But his attention returned to Emily as she lifted the tray again, steadier now, her posture unchanged, her focus absolute, and for a brief second, as she turned to walk back onto the floor, their eyes aligned across the distance, not long enough to hold, not enough to be noticed by anyone else, but enough for him to see something most people missed. Not embarrassment, not fear, but control, the kind that did not need to announce itself, the kind that held steady when everything around it tried to shake it. And in that moment, the room felt quieter to him, as if the real noise had never been the laughter, but the assumptions behind it, and for the first time since the glass had fallen, Daniel Hayes shifted forward slightly in his seat, his attention no longer passive, no longer just observing but preparing, because some moments did not need interruption, they needed timing, and he was waiting for exactly that. Emily stepped back onto the floor with the new tray balanced evenly in her hands, each glass aligned, each movement measured, the earlier laughter now reduced to a low hum that lingered more in memory than in sound. But the table that had started it all had not completely let go. One of the men glanced up as she approached, his expression carrying the faint trace of amusement that had not quite faded, as if he expected something else to go wrong, as if he was waiting for it. Emily stopped. Beside the table, her posture straight, her voice calm and even. "Your replacement drinks, sir." No hesitation, no edge, just clarity. She placed each glass down with precision, one by one, the faint clink of crystal against marble softer this time, controlled, deliberate, and for a moment, nothing happened, no comments, no laughter, just a brief pause where the room seemed to decide what came next. Then the same man leaned back again, swirling his drink slightly. "Careful now. Do not drop." These two. A few quiet chuckles followed, weaker than before, but still present, still testing. Emily met his gaze briefly, not long enough to challenge, not short enough to seem afraid, just enough to acknowledge. "Of course, sir," she said, her tone unchanged, and then she stepped back, ready to move on, and that was when Daniel Hayes stood up, not abruptly, not with force, but with a kind of calm that drew attention without asking for it. The subtle shift of a chair against the floor, the quiet straightening of a jacket, small sounds that carried further than raised voices ever could. Conversations nearby began to slow, eyes turning, not because he demanded it, but because something about his presence suggested importance. He took a step forward, his gaze settling on the table, not on Emily, not yet, but on the men who had filled the last few minutes with laughter, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, measured. "I have a question." Simple words, but they landed differently. The room did not fully fall silent, but it leaned toward him, attention narrowing. One of the men at the table raised an eyebrow, half curious, half dismissive. "Yeah." Daniel's expression did not change. "Which one of you has never made a mistake?" The question hung in the air, not aggressive, not accusatory, just placed there with quiet certainty, and for a moment, no one answered. The man who had been speaking earlier shifted slightly in his chair, a small movement, almost unnoticeable, but enough to reveal the change. the confidence that had fueled the laughter now meeting something it did not expect. Reflection. Daniel let the silence stretch, not rushing to fill it, not repeating himself, just allowing the weight of the question to settle where it needed to, his eyes moving briefly across the table. Not challenging, not judging, just observing. And then he added just as evenly, because if that is the standard, I would like to meet the one person in this room who qualifies. A faint shift in the atmosphere followed, subtle but undeniable, the kind that happens when a moment turns without warning. The laughter gone now, replaced by something quieter, something more aware. Emily remained still, just a few feet away, her hands lightly clasped in front of her, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply present, as if she understood that this was no longer her moment to carry. And Daniel finally turned his gaze toward her, not with sympathy, not with pity, but with recognition, the kind that did not need explanation. And in that brief exchange, something settled into place, not loud, not dramatic, but clear enough that everyone in the room could feel it, even if they could not name it, because the moment had shifted, and it was no longer about a mistake. It was about what came. After it, no one spoke immediately, not because they agreed, but because the question had nowhere to go. It did not accuse, it did not demand, it simply existed, and that made it harder to dismiss. The man who had been leading the laughter cleared his throat lightly, forcing a smile that did not quite settle. "Look, it was just a joke," he said, his tone shifting, softer now, less certain. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the words without accepting them. "Of course," he replied, calm, controlled. "Most things are." And for a brief second, there was something almost reflective in his voice, as if he had heard that same justification before. Many times, in many different rooms, the table fell quiet again, not out of respect, not entirely, but out of uncertainty, the kind that appears when the rules of a moment change without warning. Daniel's gaze moved from one face to another, not lingering, not pressing, just observing. And then he stepped slightly aside, his attention finally returning to Emily. "You handled that well," he said, simple, direct, the words landing differently than the laughter that had come before, not louder, but heavier. Emily inclined her head just slightly. "Thank you, sir." Her voice steady, professional, but there was a subtle shift now, not in her tone, but in the space around her, as if the weight she had been carrying alone was no longer entirely hers. Daniel reached into his jacket, pulling out a card, placing it on the edge of the table beside her tray, not with display, not with ceremony, just a quiet motion. "For the service," he added, and then, almost as an afterthought, "and for the composure." One of the men at the table glanced down at the card, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized the name, the realization passing across his face in a way he could not fully hide. The shift was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, posture adjusting, expressions tightening, the confidence that had fueled the earlier comments now replaced with something more cautious, more aware. Emily did not look at the card right away. She simply nodded again, "I appreciate that," and moved to step away, but Daniel's voice stopped her, not loudly, just enough. "It is not about the mistake," he said, his tone unchanged. "It is about what you do after it." The words were not directed only at her. That much was clear. They settled into the space between everyone present, the kind of statement that did not need to be repeated to be understood. Emily met his gaze for a brief moment, just long enough to acknowledge what had been said, then she turned and continued across the floor, her pace the same as before, her posture unchanged. But the room she moved through felt different now, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Behind her, Daniel remained standing for a second. Longer, his attention drifting once more to the table, where no one laughed anymore, where no one spoke, at least not right away, and then he returned to his seat, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the moment had simply passed, but the shift remained, subtle, steady, impossible to reverse, because something had been revealed, not loudly, not forcefully, but clearly enough that it could not be unseen, and in a room that had once chosen noise. Silence now carried more weight than anything that had been said before the restaurant slowly returned to its rhythm, but not quite the same as before. Conversations resumed in lower tones, laughter replaced with something more measured, as if the room itself had adjusted its volume. Emily moved between tables with the same steady pace, her tray balanced, her attention precise. But now, people looked at her differently. Not all of them, not entirely, but enough to be felt, a glance that lingered a second longer, a voice that softened when placing an order, subtle shifts that did not need to be announced to exist. At the table where it had all started, the men avoided meeting her eyes when she passed again, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet discomfort. One of them reached for his glass, taking a sip he did not seem to taste, as if the moment had followed him past its ending. Daniel Hayes remained seated by the window, his posture relaxed, but his attention still present, not fixed on her constantly, not obvious, but aware in a way that suggested he had not dismissed what had happened as easily as the others had tried to. His phone lay untouched on the table, screen dark, a rare occurrence for someone in his position. A server approached him briefly, asking if he needed anything else. He shook his head lightly. "I am fine." His voice calm, and then his gaze shifted once more across the room, tracking Emily as she stopped to assist an older couple near the corner, her tone gentle, her movements patient, adjusting a chair slightly, offering a quiet suggestion from the menu, small actions that carried no audience, no recognition, but revealed more than the earlier moment ever could, because this was who she was, without pressure, without scrutiny, simply consistent. And that, more than anything, held his attention. In the service station, Emily finally allowed herself a brief pause, setting the tray down, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the counter, not trembling, not unsteady, just still, as if resetting. The other server glanced at her again, this time with a hint of admiration. "That guy," she said quietly. "Do you know who he is?" Emily shook her head once. "No." The answer simple, honest. The server leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "That is Daniel Hayes." The name hung there for a moment, carrying weight that Emily did not immediately react to, not because she did not recognize it, but because it did not change what had already happened. She gave a small nod, acknowledging the information without letting it define the moment. "I see," she said, and reached for another order ticket, returning to work as if nothing about her role had shifted. Across the room, Daniel watched that too, the absence of reaction, the lack of urgency to interpret his involvement as something more than it was, and a faint, almost imperceptible expression crossed his face, not quite a smile, but something close, because he had seen many people respond differently to far less, had seen recognition change behavior instantly, posture, tone, intent, but not here, not with her, and that confirmed something he had only begun to suspect earlier, that her composure was not situational, not a reaction to pressure, but a constant, something internal, something steady. He reached for his glass, taking a slow sip, his eyes briefly lowering, then lifting again, as if a decision had begun to form, not impulsive, not dramatic, just quiet, deliberate, the kind that did not need to be rushed, because moments like this were not about what was seen, they were about what was understood afterward. And as the evening continued, one thing had become clear in a way no one could undo. The mistake had already been forgotten, but the way she carried herself after it had not, and that was the part that stayed. The dinner service moved into its final stretch, the kind of hour where the room softened, where voices dropped and the sharp edges of the evening began to fade. But some moments did not disappear with time. They settled, quietly, beneath everything else. Emily continued her work with the same steady rhythm, clearing plates, refilling glasses, offering small, precise acknowledgments that never lingered longer than necessary, her focus never drifting, her pace never rushed, as if the earlier disruption had never existed. Yet the room around her carried its echo in subtle ways. A chair pulled out for her before she approached, a thank you spoken a little more clearly, the absence of careless remarks where they might have been before. Across the window table, Daniel Hayes finally reached for his phone, glancing at the screen for only a second before setting it back down. Whatever waited there could wait longer. His attention remained anchored in the present, watching the patterns that revealed themselves only to those willing to look long enough. Emily approached his table with a glass of water, setting it down with the same quiet precision she had shown all evening. "Would you like anything else, sir?" she asked, her tone even, professional, unchanged by everything that had already passed between them. Daniel looked up at her, not immediately answering, as if considering something beyond the question itself. Then he shook his head lightly. "No, thank you." A brief pause followed, not uncomfortable, not forced, just present, and then he added, "You stayed consistent." The words were simple, almost understated, but they carried intention. Emily held his gaze for a fraction longer than before, just enough to register the meaning behind them. "I try to be," she replied, no pride, no deflection, just honesty. Daniel nodded once, as if that answer confirmed more than it explained, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The space between them filled not with silence, but with understanding, the kind that did not need elaboration. In the background, the manager moved through the floor, checking tables, ensuring everything appeared as it should, but even he seemed more measured now, his earlier sharpness replaced with something quieter, more aware of the tone that had shifted under his own watch. Emily stepped back slightly, ready to move on, but Daniel's voice came again, not to stop her, but to extend the moment just enough. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked, the question neutral, but layered. Emily considered it briefly, not because the answer was complicated, but because the question felt different from the usual one she received. "Long enough to know that mistakes happen," she said, her voice steady, "and that how you respond matters more." Daniel's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something between agreement and recognition. "That is rare," he said quietly, not as a compliment, but as an observation. Emily gave a small, almost unnoticeable shake of her head. "It should not be," she replied, and with that, she moved on, leaving the words behind like something placed carefully on the table, not meant to impress, only to exist. Daniel watched her go, the faintest trace of a smile forming and fading just as quickly, because there was something in that exchange that settled deeper than the earlier moment, something that confirmed the pattern he had been observing since the beginning of the evening. Not a reaction to pressure, not a performance shaped by circumstance, but a standard she carried with her regardless of who was watching, regardless of what was said. And that, more than anything else, was what held value. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze drifting once more across the room, but the decision that had been forming earlier now felt clearer, more defined, because some qualities could not be taught, could not be demanded, they could only be recognized, and once seen, they were difficult to ignore. The check arrived quietly at his table, placed with the same care as everything else, and Daniel glanced at it briefly before reaching for his pen, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving with the same calm certainty that had defined him all evening, as if what he was about to do was not a reaction to a moment, but a response to something much larger that had revealed itself in the smallest of ways. Daniel signed a receipt with a steady hand, his pen moving without hesitation, the number he wrote deliberate, not exaggerated, not careless, just precise, the kind of decision that did not need to be reconsidered once made. He placed the pen down and closed the folder, leaving it at the edge of the table where it would be found naturally, without announcement, without display, and for a moment, he remained seated, his gaze drifting once more across the room, not searching, not scanning, but observing the final impressions the evening had left behind. The table that had laughed earlier now sat quieter than the rest, their conversation restrained, their attention turned inward rather than outward, as if something unspoken lingered between them, something they had not expected to confront. Across the floor, Emily continued her work, unaware of the exact figure written on that receipt, unaware of the decision that had just been made, but not unaware of the shift in the room. She could feel it in the way people spoke, in the way they no longer treated her as background but as presence, subtle but real. She approached Daniel's table once more, reaching for the folder with the same composed movement she had shown all night. "Thank you for coming in," she said, her tone warm but professional. Daniel stood as she did, a small, almost instinctive gesture, not required, but natural to him. "Thank you for the service," he replied, and for a brief second, their eyes met again, not as customer and server, but as two people who had shared a moment that neither had tried to control. Emily gave a slight nod, opening the folder only after he had stepped back, her eyes lowering just enough to read the receipt, and then, for the first time that evening, something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone else, but enough, a pause that lasted no more than a heartbeat, her fingers still against the paper, the number written there far beyond what the bill required. Not excessive in a way that felt performative, but significant in a way that felt intentional. Beneath it, a single line, written in the same steady hand. Consistency is rare. Do not lose it. Emily read it once, then again. Not because she did not understand it, but because she recognized the weight behind it, and when she looked up, Daniel was already moving toward the exit, his pace unhurried, his presence quiet even as it drew attention from those who now recognized him. The door opened, a brief rush of cooler air slipping inside, and then he was gone. Just like that, no final glance, no expectation of acknowledgement, as if the moment had already served its purpose. Emily closed the folder gently, her hand resting on it for a second longer than necessary. Then she set it aside, returning to her work, not rushing to share, not calling attention to what had been left behind, because that was not what mattered. What mattered had already happened. In the way the room had changed, in the way she had remained unchanged within it, at the table near the center. One of the men who had laughed earlier glanced toward her, his expression uncertain, as if considering whether to say something, but he did not. The moment passed, and he looked away, and that, in its own quiet way, said enough. Emily picked up another tray, adjusting its balance with the same practiced precision, her movement steady, her focus clear, and as she stepped forward into the rhythm of the room once more, nothing about her pace had changed, nothing about her posture had shifted, but everything around her had, and the difference was not in what had been said, but in what had been understood, because some lessons were not delivered loudly, they arrived in silence, and stayed long after the noise had faded. The night began to settle into its final hour, the kind where the energy softened and the sharp edges of the evening gave way to something quieter, more reflective. Chairs shifted back slightly, conversation slowed, and the steady rhythm of service turned almost meditative. Emily moved through it all with the same composed presence, clearing the last of the plates, aligning utensils, offering a final refill of water where needed, her steps consistent, her focus unchanged. But now there was a subtle awareness in the room that had not been there before, not directed at her, not openly, but present in the way people carried themselves around her, a respect that had not been asked for, but had arrived anyway. At the service station, the other server finally could not hold it in any longer, her voice low but filled with restrained excitement. "You saw that, right?" she said, glancing toward the folder Emily had set aside earlier. Emily did not reach for it again, did not react with surprise or urgency. She simply continued folding a cloth, her movement steady. "I saw," she replied, the simplicity of the answer grounding the moment rather than elevating it. The other server shook her head slightly, almost laughing under her breath. "Most people would not have handled that the way you did." Emily paused for just a second, her fingers resting against the fabric, then resumed. "Most people are trying to prove something," she said quietly. "I am just trying to do my job well." The words were not dismissive, not modest in a way that asked for reassurance. They were matter of fact, as if she had already settled that truth long before tonight. Across the dining room, the manager approached her again, his expression different this time, less sharp, more measured. He cleared his throat lightly. "Good work tonight," he said, the words brief, but intentional. Emily nodded once. "Thank you." No lingering, no shift in posture, just acknowledgement. The manager hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if considering whether to say more, then chose not to, turning away and continuing his rounds, the moment complete in its simplicity. Near the center table, one of the men who had laughed earlier stood up, adjusting his jacket, his movements slightly slower than before, as if weighed down by something he could not quite name. As Emily passed by, he spoke, not loudly, not for attention, just enough for her to hear. "About earlier," he began, then stopped, the words not forming as easily as he might have expected. Emily turned her head slightly, giving him her attention without fully stopping. "Yes, sir." Her tone neutral, open. The man exhaled quietly. "It was unnecessary," he said, the apology incomplete, but real enough in its effort. Emily held his gaze for a brief moment, then nodded once. "It is all right," she replied, not dismissing, not emphasizing, simply closing the moment without extending it. The man nodded back, almost relieved, and stepped away, returning to his table, and just like that, the tension that had lingered there dissolved into something quieter, something resolved without needing to be revisited. Emily continued on, her tray balanced once more, her movements unchanged, and as she reached the far end of the room, the window where Daniel Hayes had sat now empty, the chair pushed in neatly, the space left behind looked no different than any other, but the absence carried a presence of its own, not because of who had been there, but because of what had been seen, what had been recognized, and what had been left behind without expectation. Emily paused there for just a second, not looking at the chair, not searching for anything, just standing in the space as it was. Then she turned and continued, the night moving forward, the work continuing, and the moment settling into memory, not as something dramatic, not as something that demanded retelling, but as something quieter, something that confirmed what had always been true, that dignity did not arrive with recognition. It existed long before anyone chose to notice it, and once seen, it did not need to be proven again. The last guests began to leave one by one, the soft chime of the door opening and closing marking the end of a night that had quietly changed more than it appeared to. Chairs were pushed in, tables cleared, the glow of the overhead lights reflecting off clean surfaces that held no trace of what had happened hours before, yet the feeling remained, subtle, steady, like something the room itself had chosen to remember. Emily stood at the service station, folding the final stack of cloths with the same care she had shown all evening, each movement unhurried, each detail attended to, as if consistency did not end when the room emptied, but continued long after. The other staff moved around her, their voices softer now, conversations drifting toward the ordinary, plans for tomorrow, small complaints, light laughter, but every so often, a glance would shift toward her, not intrusive, not curious, just acknowledging, as if they had all witnessed something they did not need to discuss to understand. The manager approached once more, this time without urgency, without correction. He paused beside her, his posture less rigid than before. "You handled tonight well," he said again, but this time the words carried more weight, less like a passing comment, more like recognition. Emily nodded slightly. "Thank you," she replied, and that was enough. No elaboration, no attempt to extend the moment, because it had already settled into place. Outside, the street was quieter, the city moving into its late-hour rhythm, and somewhere beyond the glass, Daniel Hayes had already disappeared into that flow, his presence reduced to memory, his words left behind without expectation, the receipt now tucked safely into the drawer, not displayed, not shared, simply kept, not for its value, but for what it represented. Emily finished folding the last cloth and set it aside, her hands resting lightly on the counter for a brief moment, not from exhaustion, but from pause, a stillness that allowed the night to close without rush. She did not replay the laughter, did not hold onto the apology, did not dwell on the number written in ink, because none of those defined what had mattered most. What stayed was something quieter, something she had carried long before tonight, and would carry long after. She stepped away from the station, turning off the final light in that section, the soft click marking the end of the shift, and as she moved toward the exit, her reflection briefly caught in the glass, unchanged, steady, composed, the same person who had walked in hours earlier. The same presence that had not bent under pressure. And that was the point. Not that the room had changed, not that someone powerful had noticed, but that she had never needed them to. She reached for the door, stepping out into the cool night air, the city stretching ahead in quiet lines of light and shadow, and for a moment, she simply stood there, breathing in the stillness, before moving forward, her pace calm, her path unchanged, because some things do not need recognition to have value, and Some standards do not rise in response to the world. They remain steady regardless of it, and that is what people remember. Not the mistake, not the laughter, but the quiet strength that followed it, the kind that does not ask to be seen, but once seen, is never forgotten because in the end, she did not raise her voice. She raised the standard.